Good morning. Thank you for coming back for the second session, or for me anyway. I'm planning to talk more about exposure surveillance than health surveillance, but it's clearly related to health surveillance, and I will talk a little bit of health surveillance as well. Just to start off, I think in yesterday's talk I didn't say thank you for the invitation, so I apologise if I didn't, but thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation to attend. It's the first time I've been to Brazil, and I've been only here for about 36 hours, but made to feel very welcome, so I do appreciate it. And I also forgot to talk about my background. I'm not going to do it in much detail because we haven't got time, but just to say this was my 5th ever paper, Clinical Aspects of Malignant Mesothelioma in Australia. And I didn't realise how long ago that is, so that's 25 years ago, which shows you how old I am. But I've been working in this area on and off for a long while. This is what I'm planning to cover today. And I'm going to start with a few questions which I developed focused on Australia, but they clearly have relevance to Brazil. Then I'm going to present some information relevant to those, and then give you a few things to think about, and end with a bit of a discussion about how that might be relevant to you for Brazil. So here are the questions that I'm planning to go through, so have a think about what you think the answers are now, and then we'll go through at the end. So current occupational exposures to asbestos, so that's not the old ones, but currently will lead to new cases of asbestos-related disease, so true or false for all of these. Current home renovations will lead to new cases of asbestos-related disease. Asbestos is just an occupational issue. All asbestos material should be removed from the built environment. There's good information about asbestos exposure, and I'm focusing on Australia, but think about that in Brazil as well. And using data from the mesothelioma registry, and this is the same if you develop your own registry, is the best way to monitor evaluation and control efforts. So they're the questions we're going to consider. So look at that first one. Will current occupational exposures to asbestos lead to new cases of asbestos-related disease? Well, there's not fantastic information in Australia about asbestos exposure. There was a relatively recent study done that I was involved in, I didn't run though, that showed that about 5% of males in Australia, and that's about 250,000 workers, are still exposed to asbestos. Fortunately not at high levels, but still have some exposure. And the whole range of occupations, I've just listed a few of them there. But the level of exposure isn't well known. It's almost certainly low in most circumstances, as you would expect, but we really don't have good information on the level of exposure. And if you just monitor the cases, we won't get information on that because the current cases are reflecting exposure, as we know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So that's the first question. Second question, will current home renovation exposure to asbestos lead to new cases of disease? Well, we don't know much information about that either in Australia, and I presume you don't have great information on that in Brazil. There isn't much information about the levels of exposure. There's a little bit from a couple of studies that suggests in DIY, that stands for do-it-yourself exposures, that there was exposure, or that about 8% of people who had been involved in that sort of work through cutting, drilling and sanding had been exposed to asbestos. And that asbestos was coming from asbestos sheeting that 14% of people had been exposed to, and loose fill asbestos, which is a real concern that 2% had been exposed to. And there have been a few recent exposure measurements done in simulations that raised concerns about what the levels of exposure were, that they were quite high. There's also information on awareness, so how well did people know what sort of risks they might face and how to protect themselves from it, and those also suggest that there are problems. And you won't get answers from that just from information from a registry, because again, it's not giving us information on current exposures and the effects of those. Well, you can't read that very well, sorry. The next question was about asbestos in the built environment. And I just want to take you briefly through a few examples that I've listed here, but I'm going to go through each of them separately. So I don't know whether you've heard about the Mr. Fluffy case in Canberra. Canberra is the capital city of Australia. It's where I grew up. And in the 70s, there was somebody who drove around Canberra in a truck loaded with amosite and offered to spray it into the ceiling cavities of houses. And so there was over 1,000 houses where that occurred, and it just sat there for a while. And people realised in the 90s that there was actually a problem, and the government, who were concerned about that but were seen as partially responsible for allowing it to happen, paid for it to be removed from the houses where it was known. And then about 10 years later it was found that that removal wasn't fully effective, caused a big political storm, and the government bought back 1,200 houses, compulsorily acquired them and knocked them all down. And that's still happening at the moment, costs hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So the question is, was that appropriate or not? That's an example. I presume you've heard about the Christchurch earthquake. So Christchurch is in New Zealand, and there was a big earthquake there in about 2013, I think it was, and it demolished large parts of the city, and large parts of the city had been built heavily with asbestos, and it caused a huge problem with exposure and potential exposure to asbestos, and the city just weren't cut out to know how to deal with that. It was a very, very big public health problem and remains a problem still. In Australia, and I presume it's a problem here, there are problems with bushfires and cyclones, and the difficulty with those in terms of asbestos is that causes unrestrained release of asbestos, materials that are in situ and might be okay if the houses aren't damaged or the buildings aren't damaged. They get damaged in bushfires and cyclones in an uncontrolled way, and that then has actual and potential exposure to asbestos. In Australia, and I presume in Brazil, there are a lot of places where asbestos had been used 30, 40 years ago, and those places, those buildings are now being knocked down and the areas are being reused. And we're finding a lot of places, and this one I've shown you here is right on Sydney Harbour, where there was a big area of land that used to be the Docklands that have been reclaimed. And I was asked to come in to give some advice because they found lots of asbestos in the soil, and they were planning to take the soil from one area to another, and there were concerns and problems with the way that was going to be done. And that same thing is happening in lots of places across Australia. And finally, in terms of home renovation, I have mentioned that to you. That's my home actually, but a long while ago, 16 years ago. Okay, so that's asbestos in the environment, in the built environment. And in terms of asbestos exposure information, there's a lot of things that we don't know in Australia in terms of asbestos exposure. I've referred to a few of them, and I presume these will be things that you'll need to consider as well. So what sort of exposures are occurring in occupational circumstances? In home renovation circumstances, if asbestos is in situ, so in buildings, but it's in good condition, is that an issue? What if it's in bad condition? Is that an issue? And at what sort of level? In natural disasters I've referred to, in non-natural disasters, the asbestos in the soil I mentioned, and something I hadn't referred to before, and I suspect it might be an issue in some places in Brazil, it certainly is in Australia, is exposure from naturally occurring asbestos. So asbestos in rocks just exposed, and people potentially being exposed to that. So it's a concern for us in people building roads, in farmers, and in populations living in rural areas. So I think you should keep in mind that you need different data depending on what it is you want the information for. So if you wanted to monitor disease, you probably need different data than if you want to monitor exposure. You could monitor behaviour, monitor awareness, monitor the effectiveness of your intervention activities, and all of those are likely to need different information. And certainly just from a registry, which I think is important for Brazil, just that information is not going to be enough to answer all those particular areas or to support those areas. So to go through each of those, and I've modestly called this my manifesto for you. First, if you want to monitor disease, then I think you need a registry for that. There are a range of asbestos-related diseases, of course, but as has come up several times, mesothelioma is probably the thing that you need to focus on because that's the only one you can definitively put down to asbestos exposure. But there are problems with that. You've got to be recognising the mesotheliomas. They've got to be properly identified and reported in the health system, and you've got to have a way of knowing what the numbers are. So that is useful, and associated with it are burden of disease estimates are also helpful there. In terms of monitoring exposures, you need to do targeted measurements in particular areas where you're concerned. You can also monitor behaviour, so you can watch the way that people who are potentially exposed to asbestos are working or are behaving. And you can get self-reports, for example, of what people do. You can monitor asbestos awareness, and we have a National Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency that conducts surveys, and there's also information in press reports which is sometimes useful. And important thing for you to do is if you do an intervention, you should be evaluating those to see how effective they are, and there's a range of ways to do that we haven't got time to go into today. Some other things I think you should think about, and I'm not going to go into detail of these, but to think you need to know what are the risks, so you need the exposure information, but what are the risks of action or inaction, and what are the benefits of action or inaction? And so Anthony mentioned yesterday about exposures in schools. If you take the material out, what if you leave it in? There are risks and benefits both ways. You should think, who gets the benefit and who faces the risk, because they're not necessarily the same people. And finally, you need to think, well, what are the costs and savings involved? And I certainly don't think you should be focusing on money from that point of view, but clearly you need to take that into account. So let's go through those questions again. Current occupational exposures to asbestos will lead to new cases of asbestos-related disease. Is that true or false? Well, unfortunately, that's probably true. Current home renovation will lead to new cases of asbestos-related disease. So in Australia, unfortunately, that's probably true. We don't know for sure, but probably it's true. Asbestos is just an occupational issue, and we have focused on occupation here, but clearly that's not the case. It is an occupational issue, but in Australia, and I would think in Brazil as well, there are a lot of people in the general community who face risks from asbestos exposure. All asbestos materials should be removed from the built environment. Well, I just don't know the answer to that. We've discussed it a little bit, and there are arguments for and against, and I really am not sure what the right thing to do is. My current feeling is, if the asbestos is in good condition and out of the way, it's better left because there are more important things to focus on. But I'm not sure whether that's the right decision or not. There's good information about asbestos exposure in Australia. Well, you would think that's the case, but that's not true. And I'm presuming that that's not true in Brazil, from what I can tell. And using data from the registry is the best way to monitor eradication and control efforts. Well, that's definitely not true, because current registry information is giving you an idea about what happened in the past. If you want to know whether you're being successful now, you can't use the registry to do that. You have to monitor the exposures. So in my conclusions, it is concerning that current occupational exposures are an issue in Australia, and I think it's the case here. It's concerning the same for non-occupational exposures, and it's clear that asbestos is not just an occupational issue. It's not clear whether all asbestos currently in the built environment should be removed or not, and there's not good enough information about asbestos exposure in Australia, and also not in Brazil, I think, from what I can tell. Now, I felt a little bit uneasy with this last slide about lessons for Brazil, because I don't want to tell you what to do. I feel bad, but I'm giving you some suggestions, and feel free to disagree if you like. I think you should establish a registry. I think there is benefit for that. And you use the numbers and the rates to keep the issue prominent. I think that's the big benefit from it. But don't just focus on mesothelioma. There are other asbestos-related diseases you need to think about, and you should bring up, when you're discussing it with politicians and people you need to influence, that the burden from other diseases is probably more important. But meso is the one that can keep the issue in front of people. I think a focus on exposure levels and circumstances is very important, and whatever you can do to get information about that and publicise it is important. But don't just focus on the occupational exposures. Think about the other exposures that can occur. And I mentioned in Australia particularly do-it-yourself renovation exposures, but there's also just general exposures from asbestos, especially if it's in poor condition in the community. So finally, what I'm saying to you is that I think a range of approaches you need to monitor asbestos eradication and control measures. So if you want to know whether what you're doing now is effective, there's a range of things you need to get information on. And the most important thing is to use that information not just for the sake of having it, but use it to make improvements. Thank you very much.